Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. A month ago, I shared with you a story from the 1001 Nights. What I have for you today is something completely different. I'm going to read a story by Edgar Allan Poe that is not one of his most famous stories, but it is a very short story, probably from the well-known stories by Poe, one of the shortest ones. And it has a lot of material to analyze and quite a few fantastic themes that we can explore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the story, and after that I'm going to share with you some of my ideas on it, some of the things that I was thinking about as I read it, and then also some recommendations for further reading. Now, before we get into the story, I want to tell you a little bit about the version that I'm going to read. This story, The Oval Portrait, was published originally as Life in Death. That was the original title of the story. And that version of it included an introductory paragraph that later on Edgar Allan Poe decided to excise. He decided to get rid of that because it did not do to the story what he wanted it to be. So, just letting you know, I'm going to read the story, the version of it that is titled The Oval Portrait, and it doesn't include that first paragraph. So I have some images to go with this to make it a little bit more pleasing to the eye, and I'm just going to start with the story, which I hope you enjoy. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me in my desperately wounded condition to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less, in fact, than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devoutly, devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within an inch of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favored heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the execution of the work, nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained, for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute life-likeness of expression, which at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe I placed the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art, she a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes, and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour, from day to day. And he was a passionate and wild and moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastlily in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her, who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and the proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from the canvas rarely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid, and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. Interesting story, isn't it? There are so many themes here to explore, and the most obvious one of them is, of course, the relationship between art and life. It's very interesting what Poe does with this story, because we generally think of art as creation, and it is creation in this case too. But in this story, art as creation depends on the destruction of life. In other words, representation, or the artificial, the ideal, whatever you want to call it, displaces or leads to the demise of the real. It's very interesting what happens here, right? And I think you can translate this to all sorts of realms, right? But I think about it in the realm of literature, for instance. I don't know if it has ever happened to you, it probably has, that you're reading something and when you emerge from that reading, the real world seems somehow less real than the world that you just entered in that book or that story or whatever it is that you were reading. This is a theme that Julio Cortázar, one of my favorite authors, explores in many of his stories. And I share this because it's something that happens a lot to me. To me, it's very easy to just get, so concentrated in my reading. The book just swallows me in a way, and I can spend hours reading and just entering these fictional worlds that other people, that authors have created for us, to the point that sometimes I forget to live my own life. It's like I have to remind myself, okay, it's a good thing to pass the time reading, that's fine, but don't forget life. Okay, that's what I say to myself. Stories are wonderful, but don't forget to live your own story too, because otherwise you're just letting life pass you by. I wanted to share also some ideas for further reading based on some impressions that I got while I was reading this story. For instance, one other story that I thought about as I was reading The Oval Portrait was the Balzac novella, The Unknown Masterpiece, which is also about a painter who is obsessed with his art. Balzac also wrote a story about a musician who is obsessed by this idea of producing a wonderful piece of music titled Gambara. These are from the 1830s, I want to say. So if you're interested in this idea, in the connection between life and art, that's one story that you may want to explore. One very obvious connection here that you probably already thought about is Oscar Wilde's novel, The Portrait of Dorian Gray. It is said that The Oval Portrait was a direct influence on the picture of Dorian Gray. Sorry, not the portrait of Dorian Gray, but the picture of Dorian Gray. There's also a story by Henry James titled The Real Thing. It also has to do with an artist who is trying to create a wonderful representation of the real, and he finds this couple that he thinks are just perfect, but that leads to other complications that I will let you explore by yourself. And I mentioned Julio Cortázar before. As I said, he's one of my favorite authors, and one story in which he explores this connection between art, in this case photography, so a different type of art, and reality or real life is Blow Up. It is known in English as Blow Up. It's the one that inspired the Antonioni film. In Spanish, the title is Las Babas del Diablo. So it's a much later story than the ones that I just shared with you. But I think you can also see a connection there because it also deals with how art can come to life and how that has a price, right? It seems that the price for creating a wonderful piece of art sometimes is life itself, right? It's like life becomes less real as you make art more real and more lifelike. If you want to explore the theory behind this idea, that what happens, for instance, when the symbol threatens what it stands for, what it symbolizes, right? One of my favorite books when it comes to theory is Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. So that's a great place to start if you want to explore this idea. What happens when the representation of something threatens or displaces reality itself. So I hope you enjoyed the story, The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe, and hopefully my comments on it add something to your reading or inspire you to read other texts that have similar themes and other connections with the story that I just read. I would love to hear your comments on it, as always, and also some recommendations that you might have based on this reading. I have a lot coming up for you. I mentioned Cortázar. I'm going to do a video on Cortázar because I just need to do that. And I have some book hauls coming up, a shelf tour, just to show you some of the books that I have that hopefully represent me as a reader, and many other things. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.